Welcome to the Grow Strong Leaders podcast. I'm your host, Meredith Bell, and I interview business leaders who are committed to their own growth and the development of everyone on their team. If you enjoy my podcast, be sure to subscribe and rate it on your favorite podcast platform. Welcome to another episode of the Grow Strong Leaders podcast. Today, I would like to ask you to think about something. In your role as a leader and in other areas of your life, what kinds of personal traits or habits have prevented you from being as effective as you'd like to be? My guest today has studied and written about these leadership derailers and common traps of living. And we're going to discuss some of those today. I know you're going to find this to be a very valuable conversation. So I'd like to welcome as my guest, Gregg Vanourek. Gregg, welcome to my show.
It's great to be with you.
Well, I am so excited to have this conversation with you because the ones we've had prior to this have been wonderful. And I want to give a big thank you and shout out to our mutual dear friend and colleague, Walt Hampton, because he's the reason we know each other. And it was just an inspired connection, I think, on his part to introduce us.
It really was. Love people like that who connect people. It's a great service.
It is. Well, before we jump into our conversation, let me tell my audience a little bit more about you. Gregg has studied and written about all of these leadership derailers and common traps of living for quite a while. He helps people today with leadership, personal growth, and life design through his books, courses, workshops, speaking, and coaching. He runs Gregg Vanourek LLC, a training and development firm, and he teaches at the University of Denver and Stockholm Business School. Gregg has been an entrepreneur for most of his career. He was a tech startup executive at K12 Inc, which is now a market leader with $1 billion in sales. He also co-founded New Mountain Ventures, which is focused on developing entrepreneurial leaders. He's the author and co-author, actually, of 3 influential books, including these that I have here, Life Entrepreneurs, and that's about infusing your life with passion and purpose. And the other one is Triple Crown Leadership, Building Excellent, Ethical, and Enduring Organizations. And I highly recommend both of these books. Gregg, the stories in them were just so powerful. There were tons of stories, all, relatable and so helpful because it didn't just paint a picture of success. It painted some of the trials, tribulations, and challenges that individuals and companies have faced. So let's dive in and have you start talking about some of those experiences and lessons learned from your various roles over the years as a leader that have fed into the work that you're doing today.
Sure. So maybe a few. I guess for me, my origin story, Meredith, starts in college, where I had some incredible teachers who really, I was always a committed student and worked hard in academics, but it was really in college at Claremont McKenna College with a philosophy class and a philosophy religion class where my teachers really reached into my heart, into my soul, and got me to care about big questions about, who are you? Why are you here? What are you going to do with your life? And of course, for leaders, these are deeper questions of leading self and knowing yourself. Before we can lead others well and have that privilege and that honor, we need to be able to lead ourselves well, and much less lead change in the world. And so those really just captured me, and those seeds were planted that I continue to harvest, year after year, so many years later. I also, my father is a co-author and colleague of mine to this day. We're writing a weekly leadership blog. He's a retired CEO, 5-time CEO, and did turnarounds. And so growing up, I got a front row seat, Meredith, into his not only life but his business career. And he would invite my brother and me to the company picnics or to have lunch at the office. And I've gotten to know many of his colleagues and heard all those stories. And then we've collaborated together on his leadership experiences in corporate, big companies, and my experience is more in startups and cross sector, private as well as nonprofit and a little government work, but more on the entrepreneurial side. Yeah, and then I guess I'd say another formative experience. You mentioned that scale up. I was involved with an online education startup from the very beginning, and we just rapidly scaled up. And Meredith, we almost ran out of cash twice, and we did some things well. We became the market leader, but we also made some big mistakes. And just being fresh out of my MBA program and leading a team that was in charge of a really large proportion of the company's revenues, tremendous responsibility on us to move fast under pressure, but remain a values based team with a culture, with all the struggles that you have in an early stage startup, with the tensions, right? Not only the financial tensions, but the culture tensions and the vision tensions and whatnot. So it was a real trial by fire. And it was, learning by fire hose. I was just getting so many challenges, so many lessons thrown out at me. It was a real sort of crucible experience, as Warren Bennis would say.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm curious because I can relate to that, not the rapid growth, but starting up a company and all the different things that you're dealing with. When you think back on those experiences, and if you were sitting down with someone today that was, new to either starting a company or new to a leadership role, what are a couple of things that you could share with them that you feel would help compress their learning curve so that they might avoid some of the challenges or mistakes that you faced?
Yeah. Well, I really wish I could go back. And so I love this question. So, I mean, part of it is really this dance between the short-term imperatives. And when you're doing a startup like that, that's cash constrained, that's uncertain, time pressed, chaotic, you got to have your eye on the cash balance and those imperatives, or if you're in a crisis or another difficult situation. So the dance between that, but also playing the long game and really taking the time to think through and talk through openly and build a culture with your team where together you own a shared purpose and the shared values and the shared vision of the organization. And you really ask some fundamental questions. And so in that startup, for example, we ended up having some tension between different stakeholders. And so there's the investors, the shareholders and their time horizon and their profit needs. And then there are the workers, right, and the team and the different reasons and the humanity they're bringing into your team and why they're there and what they want to do with their life and their career, what they bring, right? And then the customers, right, and who you're serving and how you're trying to add value and innovate or make their lives easier. And you can see these tensions between them. And so, we didn't spend enough time on those longer term things. We put it off, because we had a million things to do. There were reasons, right? But by doing that, over time, you build up what Steve Blank, the entrepreneur and godfather of lean startup movement, calls organizational debt. You make different sacrifices and compromises along the way. It's like when you're coding, you do that with technical code. You do some shortcuts and stuff, but as the code expands out, eventually those things can really add up and maybe break the whole thing. So you need to go back and refactor the coding. You need to go back and fix some of those shortcuts and make sure you haven't done too many, because otherwise you could really poison your culture, or you could have resentment or lack of clarity or lack of alignment. So it's that dance, I think, between the short term and the long term is a really important one. And part of that is, to your question, Meredith, being a new leader, I think you have to have as much clarity as you can possibly muster about who you are, what you're good at, what you're not, and go confidently with what you're good at, but be vulnerable and open and ask for help and be willing to collaborate with other people and create a team that comes up with the answers or that makes the decision, and not feel like it's got to be me. And then you're kind of hiding behind this air of ego or all knowing, or pretending like, and that's where you get into things like imposter syndrome and whatnot. So that inner game, and working on yourself openly, and getting other people to work on themselves so that you can grow together. And if you can grow together, you can rise to those challenges of scaling or new challenges.
Mm-hmm. That's such a great point. The knowing of yourself, I think because we get so busy, we don't take time to pause, reflect, and look within. Oftentimes, one of the things in your Triple Crown leadership book that I love so much was your chapter where you talked about head and heart. And what you were just saying made me think about that chapter. I loved the distinction you make between those two. And I would love for you to share that, because it's not an either or, it's both and, right?
That's right. Yeah. And I want to start with the premise of your question first, because I think it's important, which is that we tend to skip over that knowing ourselves deeply, and we get impatient and we get right into acting too quickly. And we tend to skip over the leading ourselves well with discipline over time. We get busy with leading others and whatnot. And so this is the point of this work, I think. So, but to your question of head and heart, and so that's one of the 5 advanced leadership practices based on our research we discovered that can help leaders build not just any organization, but one that is 3 things: excellent, ethical, and enduring. And that's what we call the triple crown of leadership: excellent, ethical, enduring. So, head and heart, the observation there is that most of us focus on head too much. Now, head is not bad. Head is good, and that's the head is kind of smarts. It's knowledge and skills and experience, and so this is relevant when you are recruiting and hiring people, and developing and rewarding people. We tend to be much too head focused. We're looking for the resume. We're looking for that, background, and what education and what training they have. And of course, you're going to need those, and we do want to vet those heavily. But what we're missing is the heart piece. And by heart, we're talking about an array of things. We're talking about the person's character. We're talking about their courage or their fearlessness, as Ursula Burns from Xerox would talk about it. We're talking about their aspirations and their passions and these kinds of things. And you get into emotional intelligence and these kinds of things. What their purpose is and how it connects to your work. And so, how much time do we spend vetting heart matters versus head matters on the front end? And then once they're in, how much time do we spend developing their heart, their courage, and their emotional intelligence and their ethical thinking? And then what do we reward? And so all along, we look for head, we develop head skills, and we reward head skills. And so we end up with organizations that are maybe great, analytical, cerebral, logical, but we're missing the heart element. And my word, when people come together at the heart level and they come to know each other as team, as human beings, as mothers and fathers and people who care about issues or passions, and when they see each other's character and their courage, that can take, the knowledge and skills and change the curve and really build this, like, a sense of family, a sense of true conviction and teamwork. And we're all in it together because we deeply care about each other. We've been open with each other. So bringing the heart into business, and that's caring and compassion and even love. And, if you're spiritually inclined, it's something that's hard to do. A lot of people are uncomfortable, or they dismiss it as too soft. But this stuff it's complicated. It's hard, but it's powerful. And so this is one of the things that can help you transform, really build a culture that can transform and really cause you to achieve peak performance and enjoy your work and love your work while you're thriving.
Mhm. You know, as I was listening to you make those distinctions and that description of heart, to me, it goes back again to a leader being willing to reflect and look at what's causing me to be reluctant, to be open, to show how much I care, and to demonstrate that caring to others. Because I think sometimes, with the emphasis, as you mentioned, on head stuff, that the heart gets set aside, and it's just not recognized how powerful that really is. In the work that you're doing with developing other leaders and helping them get in touch with this, what are some things that you recommend specifically that they could do that would help connect them at this deeper level with the people who are part of their world at work and even at home?
Yeah, great question. So I think the first thing I'd say is actually we want to be sure we're connecting with ourselves. And if we're not connecting with ourselves, how are we going to connect deeply with others? Because we're going to be frenetic, we're going to be stressed and or burned out, and then you've got this vibe. People pick up on the energy of you, the leader, you, the colleague, who's just always frazzled or whatnot. We really need to own our own space. Oprah talked about the energy that we bring into the room, and give ourselves time. Yeah, I was seeing Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, and the Bill Gates learned from Warren Buffett. You really need to preserve some reflection time, some time where you don't have just a slew of meetings, where you can do the big thinking. And that goes back to that dance between the short term and the long term again. But when it comes to connecting with others, I think vulnerability is one of the key things here. And I think this shows up in your work, but this having the courage to be open, to willing to disclose when things are hard, when you don't know the answer, be willing to ask questions. Questioning is a superpower of leadership and also of innovation. But it takes courage you know because a lot of people expect you to have the answers, or you may think that the job of leadership is to tell people what to do or to have the answers, as opposed to sometimes it's coming to that question, of the right questions, or a new series of questions that will open the gates to a whole new avenue of exploration and whatnot. And so um, being able to sit in that and be present with that. And by modeling that vulnerability, you're giving other people permission to be vulnerable too, to realize they don't have to have the answers, but together you can work through it. And then you have each other's backs. So I think that's one of the really key connection points. And it's also just asking people about their life as well, and really showing that you care. you know, uh, Paying attention to what they're saying, what they're not saying, their body language, and really trying to learn what makes them tick, and also to try to help them craft their life and their career in a way that fits with their values and their strengths. And so, I mean, there's the organizational needs that we have to attend to as leaders, but there's also the human needs. And boy, if we can help those sync up better, those are some big wins.
Mm-hmm. I love what you just said. I think that's so important. And with people having so much on their plates and feeling like, how do I make time for that? It really is a critical element to mark your calendar with time slots for this getting to know your people time. I think sometimes I don't think leaders realize what an investment they're making in the relationship and in the retention of employees by showing them how much they care, because we don't get that a lot. And I think that if leaders better understood how much that means to the other person, to have someone care enough about them that they invest their time in them, it speaks volumes.
Yeah, it does. And if I could just add real quick. So, I mean, business is about a lot of things, and any kind of work that you do, if it's government or nonprofit, it's obviously about your operations and execution. and your business model and your strategy. But all of that swims in a culture. And the culture is a collection of people, right? And so ultimately it comes down to relationships, right? And the quality of the teams and the groups and the divisions and the departments and the overall, and how committed those individuals are to the purpose, and how open, and do you have an ethical culture, are you making appropriate trade-offs. And so it all comes back to the people and the relationships, the relationship issues ultimately.
Mm-hmm. Well, at the beginning of the episode, I mentioned about your assessments and the leadership derailers. You have an assessment to help leaders understand where they may have some gaps in their own development that may be getting in the way of their effectiveness. And I would love for you to share a couple or three that you see to be fairly common with the folks who have taken this assessment, and some of the tips that you might share to help them become more effective so that that isn't a gap for them anymore.
Yeah, great. So the context of this work is I do have a leadership derailers assessment on our Triple Crown Leadership website, and it's what are the things that inhibit our leadership effectiveness. And I think often in the leadership space, we can be so focused on what to do to be a good leader, to be a good communicator, to be a good negotiator, motivator, speaker, whatever it is. We forget to talk and work on the things that we should not do, the things that we're doing that are getting us into trouble. And so I think that's important and a little bit neglected. And so this assessment has more than 60 common leadership derailers, but I think some of the most common ones are some of the things we've already talked about indirectly. They're things like burnout, overwork, or being addicted to your work such that it actually causes you can't stop thinking about it, and it causes problem with your health, physical and mental health, neglecting your relationships and other priorities in your life. And so we have a culture of overwork and burnout, right? And related to that one is, how much our identity is wrapped up in our work. But some of the other derailers are things like perfectionism, procrastination, avoiding difficult issues, being a bottleneck, where as a manager of a team or something, too much goes through you, and so you're kind of slowing people down, or you're not unleashing them to kind of fully bring their own autonomy and innovation and leadership and energy to things. I guess one other one is feedback is a real it's a derailer. And when I talk about feedback, I'm talking about two directional feedback, right? And so as a leader, we want to be good at giving feedback. And that's hard because people have a hard time receiving feedback. And so giving it in such a way that they can be open to hearing you out without getting defensive or feeling judged or overly criticized. And part of the trick there is we tend to overweight negative things versus positive inputs. And so we'll ruminate on these kind of negative things, right? And so how can you set up a holding environment for a conversation where they know that you have their best interest in mind and you want to help them learn and grow and develop and thrive and succeed, right? And so that's an art and a challenge. But the other direction of feedback is, my word, we need to get good at receiving feedback, and being not only open to it but hungry for feedback, because we know that feedback is a superpower, and that if we get good at actually soliciting feedback and getting input, and we're open to it and non-defensive, then we can kind of close off some blind spots, and we can realize where we can improve this, and we can stop doing this. And over time, boom, 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 that just revs up. And by the way, by modeling that openness to feedback, you're creating a culture and a team where you're deliberately developmental, and everybody starts getting good at giving and receiving feedback. And it's fun because you're learning and growing. Now, it's hard sometimes because it is still tough to kind of get but eventually you just get better at it. You thicken your skin a little bit, and you realize it's not about looking perfect or being right. It's about growing and getting better together.
Mhm.
So I think, but that's one conversation at a time. That's using your judgment and setting up an environment and really listening, communicating very thoughtfully, and showing the person respect, and actually showing them that you care, and that again, you want them to succeed and thrive, and you will help them. You'll be a servant leader who will clear away obstacles so that they can do what's right for the team and what's right for them.
Mhm. Well, I want to just, jump up and down in support of what you're saying about feedback in both ways, because I think that's one of the most important areas besides listening for a leader is learning how to give feedback so it's supportive, as you said, and also not just receive it, but solicit it, actively asking, how am I doing? Or what's one thing I could do better on an ongoing basis so that it communicates to others. I'm interested in growing, I haven't arrived yet. And so it makes it safe for others to also be open about growing, learning, and receiving feedback. So you're right. It has a ripple effect when the leader is willing to do this well in both directions. I love that.
Yeah, it's related to that other trap of avoidance. Part of what's hard about feedback is that we are physical creatures, and we have, a brain that's evolved. And when things are awkward or uncomfortable, we go back into our lizard brain and we get stress, and our heart rate increases and we're sweating. And so, fight or flight, we tend to avoid those difficult conversations or those tough ethical dilemmas or that fight we need to have about some issue, right? And so, how do we get better at staying calm, going up on the balcony to be able to observe the situation, as Heifetz from Harvard talks about, to get that perspective, and staying in so that we don't avoid. The leaders need to run to the trouble. They want to say, "Oh, okay, there's a problem. Let's go. Let's get curious about it. What do you think? How are we going to fix this?" And I love that Patrick Lencioni talks about conflict. He says, "Mine for conflict." Like you're a miner looking for gold, because the conflict is gold, right? Like those hard things, those disagreements, so those difficult things, those are illustrative. Those are educational. If you can find, like, what's at the root of that, because it's an opportunity to solve something fundamental, the issue behind the issue behind the issue, the deeper the root cause or whatnot. So mine for conflict, don't avoid it.
Yeah, I think the avoiding piece sometimes, goes back to our experiences even growing up. What kind of home did we grow up in where people either talked or didn't, or they didn't speak about the obvious, so you absorb this, and it plays out then in our adult lives and in our relationships where it doesn't serve us well. So thank you for bringing that one up. I know you're working on this new book around the common traps of living in general. So not leader specific, but certainly applicable to leaders, but anywhere else. And so tell us a little bit about the backstory of that. What caused you to say, I need to write this other book because of what I'm seeing here or what I've been experiencing?
Yeah, this book is interesting because it's actually a zoom in from a prior book. So you mentioned my second book was Life Entrepreneurs, which I wrote with Christopher Gergen, who's a friend and former colleague, a great guide. That book was about, we think of entrepreneurship as starting a business or being innovative in a big company, the entrepreneur, or being a social entrepreneur and solving hunger or climate or water issues or trafficking, whatever. But so we said you can be a life entrepreneur, and you can bring the principles and practices of entrepreneurship to living your whole life. Yes, starting a venture maybe, but also just thinking about living with purpose and passion and adventure, and marshaling resources to to have fun and do the things that align up with your values. And in that book, there was just one little section about the pitfalls. It was like, what are the things that stop people from doing this? That one for me, I just keep seeing people fall into those pitfalls, and I keep falling into some of those pitfalls. So I said, wait a minute, there's something there. So I'm just taking that one little page and blowing that up into a book with a bunch of new research and say, what are the common traps of living that inhibit our happiness, our quality of life, our fulfillment, our performance? And so it's kind of like the same thing we said on leadership. Sometimes we're so focused on the good things we forget to deal with the inhibitors. And my observation, Meredith, is that these traps are like a broken record. They just keep playing in our life over and over again, and they cause us real trouble with our relationships, with our what we're trying to do. And often we're not aware of them. They're so ingrained, or we're so habituated to doing them. And so to be able to identify our top traps and deal with them can be a big breakthrough, because it can really free up a lot of negative, it can take us away from a lot of wasted time and a lot of wasted mental and stress and emotional angst, and just free us up so that things are lighter and easier. And we come back to ourselves in a way. We're kind of the better version of ourselves. So that's the point of this work.
Mm-hmm. So when you think about, and I so understand what you're saying about we go in circles, repeating, and then we're reinforcing the behavior sometimes we realize it's causing us problems. Other times we're blind to it. So you have this new test related to the identifying the traps. Talk about how you came to create that and the specific elements that you're assessing there.
Yeah, so in this test also has, on the current version, it has more than 60 common traps of living. And so I've been, researching this with different types of research over the years. It started with that little thing, and then I've been reading books, been interviewing people, coaching people through my teaching, where I do leadership teaching with executive MBAs. I'll give them a traps test, and people will fill it out, and they'll add traps and whatnot. We'll have discussions and what's a real trap and what's the sign of a trap. And so there's been some advances in thinking about like, and what are the fundamental traps, like the first order traps versus second order, these kinds of things. And there's some really good material out there. There's a wonderful book by Shirzad Chamine called Positive Intelligence. And a lot of people are focused on emotional intelligence and social intelligence. There's other things like spiritual intelligence. But he has what's called positive intelligence, and he's got 10 saboteurs of the things that we do that cause us to go from positive state to negative state, individually, in teams, and in organizations. And so that's some brilliant work and research, et cetera. So I'm kind of drawing on a bunch of things and just kind of developing this tool in real time on the common traps of living.
So you were talking about some that are sort of fundamental, and then some that are, I guess, kind of roll out from those. Talk about a couple of the fundamental ones that probably most people would connect with or relate to.
Yeah. So I actually have data now from the version 1 of the traps test has been up, and I have, getting to about 700 responses from around the world. I have the data on the most common ones. And what was really interesting finding from this first round, right, and before I'm moving to version 2, is how many of them get to the way we think that's unproductive. And so the most common trap so far is overthinking, ruminating, and worrying. And this is by far. And so just a lot of people are suffering with their head is spinning, and they just can't shut it off. Like, obviously thought is good. Like, if you're a leader, you need to be able to reason and think it through, and kind of so that you can come to decisions and make judgments. But if it's just spinning and spinning, and you're sitting with your spouse over dinner and you're just spinning on the problem, and you're at your kid's soccer game, but you're spinning and spinning, and late at night you wake up and you're just spinning and spinning, right? This is not productive, right? And then another very common trap is negative self-talk. And so this is that, and I call it a mental prison that we've built for ourselves, where we are so brutal about ourselves. We are so judgmental and harsh, right? And so Tara Brach is kind of a spiritual author, and she talks about we're walking around in a trance of unworthiness where we feel dumb or why did we say that? And we feel unworthy. We feel less than because we're so brutal to ourselves. Now, my word, would we talk that way to our best friend? Would we talk that way? Would we be so harsh to our cherished colleague that we want to, that we appreciate? No, we would be supportive. And of course, we might have to say some tough things, but in a loving way. But overall, we'd be understanding and encouraging and give them grace and the benefit of the doubt. But we don't do that to ourselves very well at all. So that's another big one. And to our previous conversation, burnout, and the related kind of overwork and your identity being so wrapped up in your work, I think is a big one. So if I'm, committed to my work, that's a great thing. But if that means that when work isn't going well for whatever reason, that I feel bad about myself, you know, then you've put yourself in a very precarious situation. Have I abdicated my happiness to the circumstances of the world and the industry and the team? And maybe I got fired, maybe the industry consolidation, maybe artificial intelligence, maybe a pandemic, but can I not feel good about myself even when things are not going well? And so this like feeling great about yourself when it's going well, and there's too much arrogance and ego and narcissism, but feeling terrible, we have to get away from this and be more accepting of the world as it is, but still able to thrive as human beings through the ups and the downs.
Mm-hmm. Wow. All three of those are so important and I bet relatable for my listeners. Let's go back to that one that's number one, because I bet everybody can relate to what you were saying, that ruminating about something that happened or a person that we don't get along with that we let go of. And as you were describing the various scenarios where your mind is spinning, I thought, gosh, that means we're not being present to what's going on in the moment. So we miss out on so much because of that. So for someone who's struggling with that, we'll just call it spinning, the overthinking, what's one thing that they might be able to do to break out of that cycle and not be so obsessed with whatever it is that keeps running through their minds?
Yeah. And this really your question goes back to the head and heart they were talking about before. If we're overthinking and ruminating, we're revving on the head, we're so far away from our heart. And we're losing our deeper wisdom and the grounding of our humanity and our soul, or kind of, and our character. So I think, and that's a common trap. I mean, it's tempting to just stay right in there and stay busy and fill it up and go, go, go. But over time, since we're human and we're physical, we'll get depleted. We'll feel burned out. We'll feel tired. And it gets unproductive, right? And so having self-leadership centering rituals and habits, I think, is really important. So I would say, how we start our morning is really important. It sets up the day. And I think a lot of people don't do a very good job of leading themselves in the morning. They fall out of bed and they grab their phone and they just go right into email, or and then it's just the stressful stuff. And there's new stressful stuff, and you're reminded of the old stressful stuff. How's that going to serve you for, that you're going to be a good, grounded, wise leader during the day? And so having a really good habitual centering practice where you start your day. It could be meditation, right? It could be deep breathing, it could be prayer, it could be some deeper reading. Maybe a business leader needs to read a novel, or some spiritual reading, or something you're curious about. Maybe some affirmations, maybe some time on the deck with coffee or tea, a morning walk, or this kind of thing. And then also doing that through the day. So you're taking micro breaks and pauses, right? So that you can center. And then in your week and your month, my dad and I write about sanctuary as an important practice. And so sanctuary is a place or practice of peace where you can re-engage your heart and come back and kind of let go a little bit and tap into that deeper wisdom. And so for some people, it's getting on a kayak or a canoe or going out to a lake, or is there some nature around you? And for other people, listening to music and with a glass of wine or whatever. But some practice that kind of brings you back. And so, and over time, you get better at those so that they can become more valuable. But you have to kind of put in the work, and really do it. So those are some examples of things that they're not rocket science, they're not complicated, but boy, a lot of people skip those and they take them for granted, and to their peril.
Well, it's one of those things where if we have this habit that is so ingrained and it's hardwired in us, it's going to take time and patience to replace that with something new. And I think that one of the things as I'm listening to you, and I love all of your suggestions, but not taking on too much in terms of committing to a huge amount of time, but start small and something that you feel you could stick with, even if it's only 10 minutes in the morning. It's better than just jumping in immediately, as you say, getting into those things that reinforce that stressful aspect
Right, yeah.
of our day. So those are all really practical. Gregg, I would love to delve deeper into all of these. Because of time, we can't do that today. So what would you like to share here as we wrap up in terms of any other tips, insights, lessons you've personally learned over the years that might be valuable for my listeners?
Yeah, I think one of the themes, it seems, of our conversation, where you've taken me from head and heart and leadership derailers to traps of living, is this importance of sort of taking responsibility for ourselves and starting with ourselves and being committed to do the inner work, pay attention to the inner game as well as the outer game, and to lead ourselves as well as focus on leading others through the conversations and the feedback and the conflicts that we talked about. So I think, and a related point to that I'd add is one of the things that people struggle with is a lack of clarity about some important things. And so on the personal side, if you're not clear about your individual purpose and values and vision and goals in your current phase of life, and your vision of the good life, your strengths, your passions and whatnot. And some people have done that work, but now it's a little bit old. And how does it actually relate to your current work or your current job search or your current team? So kind of renewing that and refreshing that periodically, right? And then it goes back to also on the organizational and the team level, that lack of clarity. One of the things that we discovered is so many organizations and teams are not aligned, right? And they're not clear and cohesive about where they're going and why and who's doing what by when and how you're going to measure it and how you're going to communicate it. And that's a balance between leadership and management. And it's a process of meetings and discussions and dialogue and debate where the leader then can help synthesize all those inputs to arrive at that clarity, the simplicity on the other side of complexity, and then communicate, try things and then adjust and sort of realign. But so many people are so busy that they don't take the time to achieve that clarity and to push through that alignment and to develop that alignment and that culture that supports the long, medium, and short-term things. So then things end up being random and frustrating and ad hoc, and then performance suffers and people start leaving and whatnot because we're not having the discipline to pull people together and really keep driving that clarity and that alignment.
Mm. Oh, those are so important. Thank you so much for bringing both up, the clarity and the alignment at the individual, team, organizational level. It also, as I was listening, thinking about families as well. Where are we aligned? Where do we lack clarity? You shared such a wealth of information, Gregg, and I want to encourage people to get copies of both of your books, because you go into detail through so many of the stories and examples in Life Entrepreneurs and Triple Crown Leadership. And we'll be looking for your new book about these traps of living, because I know you'll have some wonderful wisdom that you've packed into that based on everything that you've experienced and learned through your research and through your own living. So how can my listeners, I know they'll want to learn more about you, connect with you, and learn more about your work and these assessments that you've created?
Well, thank you for asking. So a couple ways. So for the leadership focused work, our website is triplecrownleadership.com. And if you go there, triplecrownleadership.com, you can find the Leadership Derailers assessment. You can find an alignment scorecard, a personal values exercise, and other, all sorts of articles or blogs every week, and other resources around leadership. And then for the personal development and the traps of living, if you go to greggvanourek.com, and so Gregg is with two G's, GreggVanourek.com. Then the TRAPS test is on every page there, as well as other resources. There's a quality of life assessment that's super fast and simple, where you can kind of, how am I doing in my quality of life? And again, a bunch of new articles and resources there. So, and then all of our social media, YouTube and Twitter and LinkedIn and Facebook, it's all on those pages.
Great. Well, Gregg, thank you for sharing that. I know we'll have people eager to take those assessments and increase their self-awareness around those topics that you mentioned today, and even more. We couldn't possibly cover the 60 plus that are in both assessments. I want to acknowledge you and the wonderful work that you are doing, the important work you're doing, and the difference you're making in the lives of the people you work with, both in the two schools where you teach, as well as your clients that you work with, and the commitment you personally made to your own growth and development over the years, because you now have so much knowledge, experience, wisdom to share with the world. So thank you for sharing it with me today and with my audience. I really appreciate you.
Well, thank you, Meredith. That means a lot coming from you. And I'd also say, if any of your listeners take those assessments and have questions or just want to reach out, I'd love to hear from people, love to try to be helpful. So they're welcome to and on the websites, there's contact pages right there. So we're easy to get a hold of.
Oh, that's great. Well, thank you for that offer. And I want to encourage anyone who takes the assessments to take advantage of that offer from Gregg. He's just such a delight. So thank you for that generous offer. And I appreciate your being with me today.
Thank you for having me, Meredith. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks for tuning into my podcast. Now head over to growstrongleaders.com and check out our two books, Connect with Your Team and Peer Coaching Made Simple. While you're there, download the free facilitator guide to find out how to implement our unique peer coaching system. Until next time, I'm Meredith Bell.